come in this group.
Well, I'm happy to go on this. There's some stuff that I really wanted to ask you, and I wasn't sure when the Malaysia meeting was.
Well, you're the only one here, so you might as well.
All right. Well, the Lord has been putting it on, really pressing me for about a year. Well, not a year, I guess, since you released the Vision Destiny and some of the legislation you were doing. As soon as I read those, in my heart that I need to be doing those. I need to be legislating exactly the same stuff you were legislating, but it just never. There were blocks. My issues, my things were out of order, protocol, and just it was a season of waiting and seeking. Things clicked about. It was a couple weeks ago. I went through one of the. I guess it was the legislation engagement that you had done, at the Australasia one, and a whole bunch of stuff opened up. It was like I had been authorized to legislate all of this stuff, all fit together. And I finally just said, yes, Lord, I'll do whatever it is you want me to do. I don't understand it, but I say, yes, I'll do it. And immediately, things are out of order. I may not get the whole sequence of events right, but the Lord took me to Wisdom, and she smiled and was like, yeah, I figured you'd be here eventually, just waiting for the right timing on this. And then she often took me to a place I had not been before. And I was like, I knew exactly where I was the moment I stepped into it. And I was like, core of the fathers. It's like, I haven't been in here yet. And basically they stood around me, there are 24 in the room, and they exhorted me, and they said, on this. You cannot delay anymore. And I was like, whoa, the weight of it. It was like they sort of like extended their hands and prayed this Father's blessing over me. And I was wrecked. I was like, wow, this is amazing. Stuff that you've been thinking, you're right. You have to step into this. You must be obedient. You must begin to mandate and legislate this stuff. And Joshua walks up to me and puts his hands on my shoulders. And he says, Sean, do not be afraid, for the Lord will be with you. And he gave me this big hug, and I was like, wow. So there was this setting in place thing. I don't even know how to describe it, but it was in some place that I had never been before. Again, this is one of my questions. It was sort of like a small amphitheater. It wasn't like how I would envision the Court of 70 to be. I've never been there, but it would have been a small amphitheater on end, and maybe a few levels of viewing on the sides. It wasn't very large, but the Lord was there, and it was basically a setting in place. I was given this brilliant, multicolored, scintillating rainbow robe and this rainbow. I mean, I'm like, wow. And what the Lord was saying, he said, Sean, I know that I've asked you to do this. You've taken the responsibility to do it. But now I want to set you in place. We need to follow protocol, and we need to make this official. And so there was the robe, another scepter, another orb. I'm not calling you to sit you on the bench. He goes, I'm calling you to legislate. And I'm like, and I'm trying to understand what this means. And he said, I'm not calling you to sit over a nation. I'm calling you to sit over a region of nations. Oh my. So it was 3 nations of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. But he said, this is not national bench. He said, the best way you could understand it right now, Sean, is it's above that. It's a regional thing in the spirit that the Lord is wanting to do above the national level. And it said, I want you to legislate into the region. I want you to declare and decree into the region. He said, I'm not calling you to sit on the bench. I said, I'm asking you to call the benches forth is what I'm asking you to do, to legislate, that the benches will come forth, that the government will come forth, that the call is going to go out and that people are going to answer. So, wow. And I'm like, what is this? And I'm like, I got to ask Mike, is this a legislator position, like Scribe, Oracle, legislator?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, definitely. There's all sorts of different levels. You know, that's the thing with these things. It's like when you engage in the place you need to engage in that opens up the revelation. I mean, from what you're describing, you know, it sounds like the commissioning house. You know, one of the chapters houses which is commissioning, and there are different rooms and things off that different things take place in, and you know, but basically it is a commissioning. And you know, I do a lot of that, but I do it, you know, I've been given a chancellor's role and an ambassador's role, so I have a specific call to legislate for the Joshua generation rather than a particular nation or nations. That's my role's to do that for the Joshua generation, and I legislate and call and make decrees and do all those things, you know, and I'm not part of a bench for that because it's my role, you know, it isn't a bench for that. As you say, it's not for the bench that's for there, or the benches. It's actually to call benches forth. It's a legislation role to establish those things and call them out. So yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. And you know, it's one of those things that probably no one will really know you're doing it. It doesn't really matter whether anyone knows you're doing it, but the result of it will be what happens, you know. And you may have to do a lot of dealing with why there are blockages. The covering issue is going to be the biggest thing when you go into some of these areas and you're looking to bring in a revelation of what God's doing. The issues of coverings and apostolic coverings and just pastoral all that stuff will rise its head. I mean, it just does, because what you're basically saying, you're calling people to engage God for themselves, you know, not have to go through someone else. And if they're going to engage benches, those benches have to be foundational, not above. You know, they're the foundations, not the roof of the house. And that's a massive change of thinking for a huge majority of particularly the charismatic church, but generally all churches, because you know they all operate that way. I mean, our Anglican church, they operate with bishops. Then they have archdeacons, and then they have the vicars and the rectors, and there's a hierarchical structure that you have to be under. And you know, but the charismatic church is no different. The apostle, and then they have the regional leaders, and then they have this, and you end up having this structure that you're under. And if you're not under it, well, then you're not authorized. You know, well, it's just rubbish, basically. I mean, essentially, when you look at it in the Word, where does it say that? Where does it say at all that fivefold ministries are governmental? It doesn't, which has just been this assumption that they've taken a role that they, rather than equipping people, they've taken a role in ruling people, you know, and that's very clearly not what it's for. So you will come up against that when you start, and you may need to legislate into that and for it. And that's why I've put some of the legislative things up there, you know, and I will keep adding more to it, because they're key areas. You know, when I went to the US, in each of the areas, that issue came up. There was a challenge into, well, why are you coming into this area without acknowledging our covering and blah, blah, blah. And then in another place, it was like we had a room booked in this place, and then they stopped us using the room because of the whole position on coverings. You know, and another up in Kearney, it was this other thing. They came and said, well, we're the apostolic covering network over this area. You haven't invited us to come to these things. You know, how can you can't come and do this without our, you know, say so. You know, and it's just like, oh, hey, this is rattling some cages and stirring something up. But that's the very nature of all this. The old order of things does things from below, and they have an earthly structure to enable them to do things from their organizational perspective in the wilderness, effectively. And all those mountains they built in the wilderness carry that with them. And a lot of people are in the shadow of those mountains and therefore can't see. So it's going to be a huge issue that comes up more and more as these things are starting to get challenged. And what we do in calling things forth is challenging those religious spirits and those religious doctrinal things, because it's all about keeping people under control, effectively. You know, even for the nicest people who have the nicest hearts, they're still over someone and therefore a mediator. And that mediatorial spirit is a thing that God wants to deal with. And they're not going to deal with it very graciously by all the stuff that's kicking off over it. So,
Well, I appreciate you bringing some clarity. It was just, this had been what I've been wrestling with this for a year and a half, thinking, how can I take responsibility for multiple benches over nations? I was like, because I didn't understand the framework of what the Lord was trying to tell me. Finally got to a place of just being totally yielded and say, okay, whatever, I don't understand this, but okay. And then he told me what it was. He goes, it's not benches. You just assumed it was because you didn't understand. I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
It was absolutely right.
Interesting, Mike.
And you don't have the responsibility for those benches. Your responsibility is to do the calling and the legislating. They're responsible directly to God. Otherwise, we set up the same hierarchy again in heaven. And it's the same thing. It's like, no, we're responsible to fulfill a mandate to call things. They are directly responsible before God for answering that call and then functioning in that role themselves. And that's the thing. In all that I've just done in the US, I'm not responsible for that. I was just responsible to go and facilitate something and be a catalyst. I carry no weight of responsibility for what they are authorized to do now. I will help, and I'm here to be a support, but it's not I'm not carrying it. I've done my bit in that, and I'm obviously ongoingly supporting people in helping in terms of legislation and in terms of positions of government and leadership and people who are transitioning things. I'm there to support, but everyone has to answer to God for themselves, and that's the way it needs to be. But I think once you start engaging some of the more Eastern cultures, the whole pastor, leader, apostle, prophet thing is big, and they treat you, with this sort of on a pedestal, and their guys are on pedestals, and God's going to have to knock them all off. But if I ever get invited to go to those places, I might get invited once, perhaps, because I can't not share what God is doing from a new perspective. It's like, otherwise I would be doing them no favors if I didn't say, look, God wants to reform your whole structural system of government. Otherwise, you're not going to be a reflection of heaven. Well, that's going to ruffle a few feathers for sure. But hopefully people's hearts and spirits will respond to it, because it is the very nature of what God is doing. How can we have his government on our shoulders if he is not the head? And if someone else is the head, there can be no government from a heavenly perspective. So yeah, very, very interesting.
It's a good thing. Hi, Mary.
Oh, yeah.
Good morning. I thought the call was starting at 8.
No, it's always 7:30 on a Friday for Atlanta.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought it was 8.
Well, unless I put the wrong time out, but I don't think I did, but I might have done. Anyway, it's fortuitous because I had a good talk with Sean, so all good.
Been catching up, Mary.
Yeah.
Were you sharing with Mike what you shared with us on Friday night?
I was.
Okay, I'm already caught up.
Okay.
You're all caught up. No surprises for you. That's why I didn't want to reshare it with you guys, because you already heard it.
That's okay.
One,
That's okay.
one more thing, Mike, is the Lord gave me this bag. Well, actually, it was in the court of angels. He gave me a bag of 10 scrolls. Basically, they were already authorized, and I just had to see what was on them and declare them, which I thought was kind of interesting. It was like they had already passed through the court system. They're waiting for someone to step in and release those things. They're like sitting in the angelic court, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I mean, again, one of the chancellor's houses is a house of scrolls, and there are benches and benches and benches of scrolls in there, just waiting to be picked up and released. You know, I've seen them, and it's great that they're being released, and someone's going to take responsibility for outworking them, because they are, as you say, already agreed. You know, they're not things that we have to go and make legislation for. It's existing legislation, but not necessarily have been released before. You know, there's a lot of heavenly legislation which is already exists, but may not have never been released onto the earth, as well as legislation that we specifically birth from our own spirit. There's stuff which is already there for the purposes of God in areas, regions, nations, that is waiting for people just like you to say, yes,
I'll do it.
here am I, send me. Because, you know, there's a lot in that court or in the temple where God is saying, who will go for us? And the seraphim are there, and they're looking, you know, who will go for us? Those who are willing to embrace the fire of the coals. You know, those are the people who are going to say, yeah, here am I, send me. And therefore, that's why we go through the processes of preparation, that God shows us something and it takes a couple of years to get there, because we have to go through the fire to be in the place to be able to outwork it. So yeah,
that type of legislation, Mike.
Yeah.
Who would have enacted that, or is that things that God has declared previously?
It's things that have been agreed. Obviously it's coming out of the heavenly structure. So the high chancellors have been involved in producing that on God's behalf. So the mantles, the scrolls, the commissioning, the weapons, the things that are in the high chancellor's houses, they have been, and they've got a whole sort of raft of angelic beings that are part of that, that will bring and release those scrolls out and the mantles and things when people embrace it. So yes, I think there's a whole thing. Some of the things, you know, if we believe we're in the time when books are being opened that have been sealed, then some of the things written in those books are now being unveiled, and that's why these things are now being seen, because they're specific for our time. You know, they would have been pointless releasing a legislative document that related to, you know, 2016 in 1900 or 2050 or whatever. I mean, it just, you know, it's now, and therefore, you know, we need the legislation for the things that are happening now, and some of those things have never happened before. So that's why I think that there's new, because some people were saying, well, surely heaven's legislation has got all the legislation it needs. Yeah, that's true, but in our position, even in a natural sense, you know, 100 years ago, you wouldn't have needed legislation in the statute books for the internet or for, you know, phone tapping, or because phones didn't exist and the internet didn't. So you wouldn't actually have needed legislation which specifically authorized things for those things. So whenever something's new or comes, then why would we not need new legislation for its outworking? Because it may never have been seen before. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not agreed before in God. Obviously, in eternity, it's all agreed, but it may already be agreed and prepared, waiting for the time and the season and the people to come and embrace it. And then it's like the stuff that we produce legislation ourselves is because we're co-heirs. And God is wanting to teach us what it is to produce legislation for the things that we have got mandates to do. And, you know, So some of the men in white linen, others may well have been involved in the production of some of that legislative stuff. You know, some of the ancient ones, they're all, I'm sure it won't have just been one thing that's brought these things into place. But it's our responsibility then to embrace it when we get called. You know, so, yeah. But it's certainly something which is very pertinent for the moment, and is a season where these type of things are being outworked. You know, and you know, there's so much going on that, you know, we're not privy to, or we don't need to be privy to. But God is doing so much all over the place in different ways, with different groups of people where they are in their journeys. But it's all part of the overall picture to get us to the point where we're functioning as it is in heaven. And so a lot of the things that have been done from an earthly perspective, you know, they're not wasted. You know, they may not have been as effective as they're going to be when we administrate them from above, but we've learned a lot. Now we need to deal with it from the right place that will give a perspective to it to be able to outwork it in more effectiveness. Whereas, you know, so much has happened, and I think people tend to get defensive or of things that happened in the past as if we're sort of knocking it, and I'm not. I'm just saying that it was incomplete. You know, some of the things were incomplete, and some of the things need a further revelation of how you do it from a position of government in heaven, rather than how you try and work it out on the earth from a position there. And all the stuff we did, spiritual warfare, and all the things, you know, all the, I don't know, hundreds and thousands of books written on that subject, you know, from the sort of 70s onwards. You know, it's not been wasted. The insight is there, but the how you actually outwork it is now been progressively unveiled to be in a different way. You know, and you know, go back over, I don't know, that 30-40 years and see all the books that are written. I mean, I've got lots of them on my bookshelf. You know, it's, you know, Taking Cities for God, and then you had, you know, the Dawson's books on things like that, and Ed Silvoso in Argentina, and I mean, you know, I've read them all. You know, and then you had the sort of the transformation videos and all those type of things, and you know, it was all good, and it was all part of the journey, and is to move us forward. And I'm not knocking any of it, but I just know that God is now adding a dimension to it that will bring a fulfillment, because actually those books have not enabled us to see the world transformed and restored. You know, as much as they may have had some insight and all the spiritual mapping and everything else that was being done, you know, the information is still available in the record room of heaven, you know, and when that information was got, it was really useful. And some of the prophetic acts that we did were good, to repent and to renounce things and to identify, and identification, repentance and stuff. There's nothing wrong in that. It's just not the complete picture of how things are going to change. It's all part of the process, but now we've got to take it a step further, and from a heavenly perspective, look to administrate those things and engage the atmosphere from above and deal with the things which are above the atmosphere. And otherwise, you know, we won't see the total fulfillment of all those things that were postulated, really.
Do you think, as you were talking about this, it came to mind, do you think that the Lord allowed us to see that piece of the puzzle at the time because to add in the dimension of doing it from a heavenly perspective would have been so way over the top that we may have tended to throw it all out and to say, no, this is just all too weird. So he gave us a portion of it, gave us an opportunity to learn, to really learn that and accept it and learn it, and then is now adding in this dimension, because that may have been just way too spooky for a lot of people to say, okay, now you're going to do this. And oh, by the way, you're going to go into heaven and do it. I mean, doing some of that was just, even a large leap of faith.
Yeah.
But then to throw in the heavenly perspective of it may have just been, we're not going there. So
yeah,
I can see where it was like a gradual unfolding.
That, I think that's how God does many things. You know, he knows how to get us from A to Z, or Z as we would say, by getting us to go to B, C, D, E, F, G, H, because we could not cope with the large jump. A few people probably could, but not many. And those people who did were really seen as weird. You know, so yeah, I think God is very, very smart. He knows what will get us from the right place, and he knows the seasons that we need to go through to prepare us. You know, the level of revelation to engage that has increased, and the level of holiness, the responsibility of all that has increased. You know, and therefore we've got to be seeing that it is a journey, and none of that is wrong. I think part of the problem is people tend to think that we're being critical of what was done and knocking it, rather than saying, no, that was part of our journey, we've learned from it, we've engaged it, but now that journey has taken us to another level of understanding. And that's, I think, how God does move us in ways. You know, sometimes, you know, the church is like a very slow moving thing. You know, I mean, I connect up with a few Anglican friends, and they tell me of how they get things changed within their setup. Sometimes it's an inch a year, and literally, and they basically were saying they were having problems moving the altar or moving something in the church to a different place because it was in the way, and they could get no agreement with the PCC to do it. So they just moved it an inch a year until they didn't realize that it had moved, because they didn't realize it had moved in one big lump, so they didn't have any objections. And it's like, for me, I just couldn't cope. I mean, I said I could not cope with that. It would just completely wreck me to have to do something an inch a year. But, you know, but that's the way they had to work within the constraints of the system we're in. Now, I don't think that's God's ideal, but it does, you know, God does move us, you know, bit by bit, I think, you know, and that's a very valid point. And, but then we need to honor and respect the journey and the bits that we were shown. And now fresh revelations come, not just throw out what was done, but to realize that there are principles within that we can now are very useful in our understanding in what we do now. You know.
Well, I guess we can take heart from the fact that it took, what, like 4,000 years in the Old Testament to even get from relatively from the garden to Jesus showing up. I mean, it took him working with people that many years just to get us prepared to have Jesus show up. So evidently he's not necessarily in a panic in terms of things having to be done immediately. He is more than willing to work with us, even if it's slowly and methodically. Like you say, 1 inch a year. If that's all we can handle, it'll be 1 inch a year, but he's going to keep moving it forward.
Yeah. And every time we do get to a point of change, everything kicks off, because all the old ways try and defend their ways and put their protective mechanisms around those things and create the doctrines and the denominations and all the other things that come out of an unwillingness to move. And so you do get a shaking that takes place. Sometimes God has to give a bit of a shake to show where our things lie, you know, and, you know, then the shift takes place, you know, and it seems like it's a huge shift, but in reality, as you say, it's been leading up to it for a long time. I mean, look at the, you know, the end of the old covenant, beginning of the new, you know, God did a few pretty dramatic things, like opening up the graves and splitting a huge curtain from top to bottom, you know, sort of thing. And it's just like, even then, they just carried on. And then you had the Judaizers, and you had this group and that group trying to draw people back under the law. And, you know, you had them in Jerusalem saying, well, to Paul, well, you need to make sure they don't eat meat to idols and they need to do this. And it's just like, he just ignored it. He said, yeah, just, and carried on not ignoring it, because it's just, why would he want to put people under the bondage they've just been set free from? Because it's I'm very interested in Acts 15, because it was the confirmation that the tabernacle of David was in reality meant everyone could worship God without having to go through a mediator or a temple to do it, which was a big thing for them. But they still just held on to some things, and to be honest, Paul was never told to go to the Jews in every place. And it was because he went there out of probably obligation to his fellow people. They created most of the problems for him. If he'd just gone to the Gentiles in the first place, he wouldn't have had half as many floggings and beatings and other things that he got, because they stirred up most of the problem. Well, God sent him to the Gentiles. His heavenly vision was to go to the Gentiles, not to the Jews. And I don't think he was fully obedient, to that. And I think he learned in the end that he could have made it a lot easier for himself if he just stuck to what he was shown, So you see a lot of that stuff. The old never wants to let go, and therefore you have the battles, and you just have to accept that we're going to get those battles too, and we must maintain a heart of love and blessing to people who don't like what we're doing, and just bless them and legislate for the opening of their eyes so that they can engage themselves. So I've learned not to take offense at people's stuff, because it's just, you just recognize it for what it is. Whenever God does something new, you're going to get opposition from whatever was new before. Generally, the sort of things that have been around for, 1,500 years or 2,000 years, they're not really bothered, to be honest, because they just, yes, we've seen it all before. It'll come, it'll go, blah, blah, blah. Because they have their own construct type of thing. Whereas the newest thing that now is become old, and they're ones who tend to be more threatened by something coming along, which should just be an enhancement or a progressiveness of what they were doing, rather than something that they need to reject. And of course, you see it right throughout history. And
well, do you think some of that, though, comes from when I say I mean the church, a desire for, but also the pressure to, you got to do it right.
Yeah.
And when you think that you finally figured out what right looks like, it's really hard to say, well, if I try this and I thought I was right before, and what if I try this and it's wrong? The kind of thing. I think sometimes we put ourselves under too much pressure to feel like we've got to get it right, and it, because it becomes all performance based. I've got to do it the right way, and there is a measure of, you just don't go off on some freaky tangent, out in the belt of Orion or whatever, some of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Because the truth of who God is in his word, so you stick within that truth. But I think a lot of things have been so built into, you have to get it right, because if you don't, the consequences could be really, really pretty stiff. I mean, you could miss the will of God. God's going to be disappointed in you. You could completely fall off the rails and go off into, some kind of crazy error. And that is true. It could happen. But I think we get to the point that we don't even want to venture anywhere. It's almost like we've built a fence, where the Jews had the fence around the law. Yeah. I think sometimes we have the fence around Christianity, that we just don't even want to inadvertently make a misstep.
Absolutely. I think that is a huge issue. That's their fear of getting it wrong. And the reality is, all we're called to do is be obedient, not get it right. Because if we're obedient, what will seem to be wrong may well be right from God's perspective and what his plans and purposes were, because he sees some things that we don't see. Hence, all the steps on our journey, You know, people ask me a lot. It's like, well, you seem to have, you know, been on a journey that's gone to, and you do this, and then you do that, and then you do this, and then you do that, and you do the other. He says, well, and it's like, well, do you think you were wrong? And I think, no, I'm not. I wasn't wrong. It was what God asked me to do, and I learned something from it. A lot of it was I learned what not to do, but you can't learn what not to do unless you do it to see that it's not what to do. But there were still principles in the things that we looked at and we engaged that now are very beneficial, because they were helpful principles. But most of what we did was trying to outwork someone else's structure or idea or vision rather than get one from God ourselves, with a desire, because we wanted to see a harvest. We want to see revival. We want to see God move. And therefore, you know, cell church or G12 or purpose-driven church or any other sort of church, they all offered you a hope because they were successful, but they weren't the blueprint that God gave. And in the desire for wanting to see salvation and growth and revival type things, we would look to use a formula, because a formula is easy, but it doesn't often work. You know, so I learned a lot about how not to use formulas. So now we don't use a formula. We make sure that we're getting a revelation and a mandate before we do something. You know, so over the years, you know, I can see a lot of in the journey that we've taken that has moved us from one place to another place to another place. But it was all stepping stones to get where we are now. You know, God could have not moved us if we were still the same as we were 20 years ago, and we had not gone on this journey. There's no way we could have jumped from there to here. You know, even jumping from the last step to here was a big jump for a lot of people. You know, and because again, there was no manual, there was no thing, oh, this is how you do this. You know, it's just, well, trust me and keep being obedient. You know? But you know, the religious police who want to protect God and protect His word and protect, you know, the church from error, you know, are the problem, because they are setting up their own biblical parameters for what is and what isn't acceptable based on their own ideas, you know, rather than God's. And God does not need defending from anybody. You know, He's God. It's like as if, you know, He needs the legalist police to go around and protect Him and His honor and everything else, and He doesn't. But people still do it. I mean, you know, you Google anyone's name who's got any sort of reputation, and you know, the first 9 Google things you need to ignore, because you know they're going to be negative, because that's just, there's more out there which is negative than there is positive. You know, and that's just the way the church operates in its sort of self-protection mechanism to make sure we don't get into error. You know, and then it is sad. You know, I mean, you can see this even recently with Bethel, in that they withdrew from the AOG movement because the biblical parameters of the AOG movement hindered them. You know, because they basically, well, we can't be ourselves within this because we no longer can fit within these parameters, so we need to leave. And then they're now setting the biblical parameters for churches to be part of their setup and network and coverings, and the same thing. You know, they're just doing what was done to them, which is sad, really, because their whole thing was to be a ceiling, you know, a floor, the ceiling that would be the floor for the next thing to continue. And it doesn't seem that now that's okay, because once you've got a reputation, then you have to protect it. Hence, if you're teaching a whole ministry school, what you teach them becomes more and more rigid and controlled, because of the, well, we have to make sure that you're going out representing us, therefore you must carry our values and you must carry this truth and whatever, because now you're representing us, rather than, no, you're going out representing God, so just keep trusting God and following the journey, which is part of the problem. I'm not sure whether it's just an American thing, but there is obviously a lot. There is some stuff in the UK as well that, you know, but not as much. You know, I don't know. I don't know about the rest of the world, but I can certainly see it in Australia. That's for sure. In the same things being outworked there, in some of the criticism of people and the criticism of Gnosticism and various things. So it still happens, but
I don't know if the Lord will show it to me now, but I would love to be able to step back in time, and if He lets me do it. And I would like to see, what did the early church really look like? Because I think we have this idea that it was this very homogeneous blend of people that were all on the same track, and they all had the same vision, and they all thought the same. And I don't really think that was really the truth. I mean, for one thing, they didn't, we have a tendency to rely a lot on the Bible, and I'm not knocking it. They didn't have that. A lot of the people didn't read. Most of them couldn't write. They really had to depend on hearing from Jesus. That was their word that they had to go to in order for direction, because a lot of what we use as foundational material, they didn't have. So they were really flying by the seat of their pants, so to speak, and sort of making it up as they went along, because a lot of the things that we're depending on, they just didn't have. And I hope he takes me back to some time, because I'd love to see what was it really like. I think they were way more adventurous and way more had to be in the forerunning spirit, because they were really breaking all kinds of new grounds on all kinds of levels. And I don't know that it was just so happy and harmonious sometimes as we would let to believe, that they had things that they had to work through and issues that they had to deal with and come to agreement on. And that it wasn't necessarily always one big happy family. They were like regular families where you had the crazy members that you just had to be able to work through the details.
Yeah, you're right. And you only have to read the book of Acts to see that that's so, and Paul wouldn't have written all the things he did if there weren't problems. Most of it was addressing the problems that they were facing. That's why there were letters that were addressing specific things in specific places. And I think I'm very glad that Acts does not go into the detail of what it looked like, because people would have just copied it. And then it wouldn't be the variety that we have in ways. Now, even now, it's like, there's probably too much similarity and not enough, okay, well, what are we supposed to be like? What is God calling us to be? Who are we? Rather than, well, we're part of this group, so we need to sort of be in the same line vein as they are and that sort of thing. So I think, every place needs to be a reflection of that blueprint that they've been given, and therefore it may look really different. And so it should really. And I think some of the sad thing is how the West in the missionary movement effectively has, taken with it the Western culture, not just the gospel. And therefore there is so much that goes on which is cultural and nothing to do with that. And therefore now it's just a religious legalism. When I've been to Africa a number of times, they dress up in suit and ties in intense heat instead of wearing their nice colorful or white costumes that would keep them cool. And it's like, I remember going and I never took a tie. I haven't got one, to take in that sort of thing. But I basically sort of repented and asked for their forgiveness for exporting ties to Africa. And they looked at me with just like, what are you saying? So, well, all we've done is exported tradition, Victoriana mostly. Why do you think you need to wear a tie? Do you think God is bothered that you're wearing a tie or not a tie? I mean, it's just superficial externals that become the religious sort of ideals. And so much so. I mean, I've been to Brazil. I was in Brazil in the 90s when, they had sort of major sort of moves of God going on, and all sorts of gold teeth appearing in people's mouths and all that sort of stuff. And some of that was happening in the AOG church there. And the men and women weren't even allowed to sit on the same side of the church. They're still functioning under such bondage, and yet there was amazing things happening. And we had a guy who a group went over who musicians with some guys with us, and they were playing, and we had two guys who had a ponytail at the time in the 90s, and it was a huge debate whether they were going to be even allowed to play, and there was pressure put on that they would cut their ponytails off. And it's just like, what's the problem? Because it was all about cultural values. They were nothing to do with the good news, and were now legalistic things within churches. And they were very legalistic. And that is the problem. We have so much legalism and things within the framework that we just assume are okay. And it goes way beyond even those things into things that we don't even realize that we are influenced by, that I think are there, that God is starting to challenge, certainly with me. My assumptions and presumptions are being challenged all over the place, because God does not want me functioning out of some religious framework that's been imposed on me through other people's teaching that I just assumed was true. But he never told me. I just made an assumption. And a lot of people do, and there's values that are out there which aren't biblical, but are treated as if they are, and God's challenging that, because he wants to renew our minds and set us free from those values. Because there's only really one simple value: love. Basically love one another is the bottom line, and seek first the kingdom, which is a kingdom of love. So if you seek first the kingdom, you don't have to actually have anything else in order. But we put priorities and orders on things in our life from a religious framework. And one of them is particularly, it's like, God first, family second, church third. Well, who said that? Because God didn't say it. All he says is seek first the kingdom. If you seek first the kingdom, then he will direct you to have the best family values, relationship values. And Jesus also challenged the perception of what flesh and blood family was in comparison to kingdom family, because his mother and brothers were there, one in something, and he said, well, who are my mother and brothers? These are my mother and brothers. So he gave a redefinition of the order of things, so that we would not just go for a flesh and blood thing, but we would look to the kingdom. And that would mean I would be the best husband, the best father, if I sought first the kingdom, because of course he's going to enable me to outwork that in my life. I don't have to have some imposed order that I have to follow to make sure that I keep everything in its neat, tidy boxes. And I think God is wanting to challenge that a lot in our mindsets and understandings that we just don't even think about, but we are influenced and function according to. So I think there's quite a lot of shaking going to shake up those things to get us to begin to realize, wow, I didn't realize that I was operating this way because of this mindset. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that, because I'm starting to see it more and more.
You mean you've got a bigger target painted on your back?
Well, yeah. But I mean, God's the one who challenges me the most and everything. It's just sort of like we have some very interesting dialogues where I know he is about to trap me and set me up for something, but you just have to keep going with it and realize, oh no, yeah, what have I just said? Okay, yeah, now that's clear. Okay. And I have dialogues like that with God, and because he knows that he can trap me to unveil something in my mind by getting me to think about why I did certain things, because I didn't, because I had an assumption or a presumption that he wanted me to, based on some system of thought which is not his. And it's quite difficult to challenge those thoughts because we've believed them for our whole lives sometimes. And it's like, well, because God has said to me, well, why do you do that? Well, you wanted me to. And it's like, well, did you ask? Well, no. Well, why didn't you ask? Well, I didn't think I needed to ask because I thought I knew what you thought. Well, did you ask me what I thought? No. And I mean, I've had dialogues like this a lot. And it's just been like, oh my word. But, you know, I don't want any mindsets or constructs or paradigms which are not kingdom. So if they come from some religious system of thought, which I've absorbed by being in the church for the last, 40 odd years, then I want those things off me so that my mind is not clouded and veiled by that just makes me trigger automatic responses to things in ways which, are not what God wants me to do, hence, the challenge for me over the whole voting issue. It's just like, that was such a shock that I'd been voting the way I thought God would want me to vote based on my assumption of what God's way was for years and years and years without really ever asking him directly. Because I didn't think I ever needed to. Because of course God thought the way I thought. Because I thought the way he thought I thought. And I didn't think right because I was wrong. So there's a whole lot of different things. It's just, yeah.
It is just, I just get so amazed. And I know that I never even scratched the surface. When I just sit there and I just think about when I'm with him and just start to think about just how vast and awesome he is.
Mm.
And and to see how everything is so in the most minute detail that he takes care of. I mean, I like watching a lot of science shows, even though science is not my forte at all. And sometimes what they talk about, I have no clue. But when they start talking about like the intricacy of how things work, and this goes together, and this goes together, when this happens, and saying like, Lord, you are so smart that even in the most minutest, tiniest little things that we have to build these monstrous machines to get a glimpse of is like no big deal for you. And you had it figured out long before we ever got around to coming to this point. And there's probably way more that we still don't know, but the detail and the organization, like the master planning is just, to me, so mind-boggling. And I mean, that's just even in the natural realm. I mean, that just even, that's only just like one tiny little realm to say, wow, no wonder we can't figure it all out. We're never going to figure it all out because you're just way too big for us to ever claim we've got the answer, because we're never going to get it all.
No, I mean, and just to think people put God in a theological box and think they know everything that there is to know, and there is nothing more to know because everything's there in the Bible. It's just, how can an infinite, eternal God be contained within even the framework of what we could possibly understand from our present perspective? I think we will have greater capacity to be able to understand through experience in the future. But yeah, I mean, when I've been engaging eternity and in that just place of awe and wonder and wow and sort of, this is amazing. It's just, even that has just completely just caused my whole mind to realize that how big God is, how infinite, how, the whole thing when he showed me a glimpse of how he can look at every choice and decision that's made through every person who will ever make a choice and bring good out of all of them and not be fazed by it, but completely be, in control, and loving and able to create opportunities for good out of every choice that we make. I was just like, whoa, I can't even look at my own choices half the time and sort of make sense of them. And you're looking at every choice that every person makes, every microsecond of every day that will ever be in time, and you're able to hold that all now and legislate it in some way, and I just think yeah, well, it's just too amazing to even think, and
even when you think that, all the prayers that he hears simultaneously from people all around the world, yet he can hear them each individually.
yeah.
He knows how to respond to each one of them. It reminds me of the movie, I think it was Bruce Almighty.
Yeah.
When he's on the phone and everybody wants to win the lottery, and so then they do, and nobody gets any money, and then they're all mad because they didn't get what they thought.
It was hilarious. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was just so, and that wasn't even anywhere near what he goes through, but just to give you a grasp of a snapshot, a snippet of what he's listening to. I mean, I don't know that I could handle that. I think that would just sort of like drive me crazy. But the fact that all comes at him, and he's not the least bit fazed about it. It doesn't upset him in the least. He knows how to cut through all of it. He hears it all. He knows how to respond to it all. Never loses his cool. I mean, it's just way past anything any of us could ever do.
Yeah. I mean, just glimpses of that. Yeah, that I've received have just been like almost like, whoa, too much, and it's like, I can't even think about that. When he then showed me how he sees everything as all the potential possibilities that exist, and they're all now to him, and he enjoys all of them in a creative sense, I was just like, whoa. I just can look at one thing and marvel over one thing, and you look at every possible thing that could ever be, and you enjoy it all. It's just amazing. I mean, that's been part of my process to begin to expand my conscious reality of what is possible. It's just expanding of our reality, the consciousness that we have, and the effect that our consciousness has in creative ways. Because he's given us the authority as sons to be creative in his image, and therefore we actually do create every day, every second, every choice is creative. It changes reality from what could be into what is, and what will then be. Everything we do is we are history makers. Now, people don't see what the possibilities are if we were to embrace the full creative authority that we have, to align what was in eternity, to outwork that through our consciousness and how we can create. I think we would see a huge change. But just to glimpse it was just, for me, just mind-blowing. But what it did, it just expanded my mind out, because all of a sudden it was just like, wow, if I'm your son and you give me the mind of Christ, then there's got to be a way that I can expand the limitations of what I'm presently functioning in, and that can be expanded, which is why I'm sort of been doing the prayers to renew my mind and rewire my brain and change my things in there which are limitations, and open the areas of my brain which are inaccessible or have been inaccessible, but God wants to reconnect them to us. All those areas that we're not using, that have abilities that we didn't know we had, but we have to reconnect in our mind to them.
Yeah. Well, that brings the whole new meaning to, with God, all things are possible. And I know I've said it, and I've heard a lot of people saying that with God means we can't do it, but God is. So God is able to do the impossible. So with man, the impossible isn't, but God, meaning God alone, is able to do the impossible. But I don't believe it, that's, I'm beginning to realize that's not what it's like what you were talking about. It's like with him, us together with him as a partner, all things are possible. But it's not that he's doing it all. It's we're working in tandem with him.
Yeah.
And that is a little like, as you were saying, like to open up your mind to the reality of what would that look like, and how do I do that? That's an expansive thought.
It is, but that's what God is wanting to do, to expand our thinking, to see the potential possibilities and remove the limitations that exist within the frameworks of our mind. It's like, I am. Therefore, all that he is, I am in. He is omnipresent. Therefore, I must have the capacity to be omnipresent in some way. If he is all omniscient, then I must have the capacity to access all the things that he knows. Not all at once, but the things I need to know when I need to know them. He is all powerful. So in him, I have the capacity to do everything I'm called to do, however creative that is. And, we're going to see those things increase, so that our understanding of reality and truth and how we affect that is going to, I think, become to be unveiled in a deeper way, as we reconnect with the recesses of our mind which have been off limits, as they get reconnected. So yeah, it's quite amazing concepts, and you start thinking, but then that's what meditation is. It's just fixing your eyes on Jesus, just gaze and behold, and we become like that which we behold, because we are formed in that image. And the more we look at it, the more we engage it, the more we encounter it, the more it transforms us into that, and we're transfigured to begin to radiate that from our own lives, which is.
Well, there was that old hymn, which turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his marvelous face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. And we used to sing it, but nobody ever did it. And if you said that you had done it, you probably would have been run out on a rail, because you would have been dabbling in some sort of mystical woohoo. But yet, I mean, maybe the Lord graciously gave us that song and just burned it into our brains, that at some point in time, we'd be able to realize, I really can do that. This is really true. And it's been so programmed into my head that when that light bulb finally comes on, it's a lot more palatable and acceptable, because I've been singing it all along, wishing it was true. And now there's the realization of like, oh yeah, I really can do it. This really does work.
Yeah. And I think the line that is to cross is the one where we have to engage God where he is. And, if I'm going to look into his face, well, where is his face? Where is he? He's not in front of me in the physical realm unless he appears. So I'm going to have to turn to where he is within me, because we know he's in me. And I'm going to turn to where he is in the realms where he dwells, so that we can engage him in a dimensional reality. And that's, I think, the defining thing of everything that's new, that we are engaging in in the reality of that, not just a euphemism or an analogy of, well, I'm going to turn and just pray to him, which is, how we've dumbed everything down to its lowest common denominator of everything. Come boldly to the throne of grace. Well, that means I'm going to pray to God and he'll pour out his grace when I've got need, rather than, no, come boldly too, come and engage. So all those things are now beginning to be unveiled as reality and truth, rather than just analogies of something which we have spiritualized because we had no practical way of engaging it. We spiritualized it into meaning something less than what it actually was and is. But those things are there, and it is connecting with people in that and saying, well, what do you think that actually means? We sing this song. Do you think, how can you do that? And even just the discussion of, well, you mean it could be more than just what I thought? Yeah. And then it's all, that's my experience. I've actually looked at him face to face, and yeah, you might get, less and less, I think you'll get run out of town. But some of it, I think, will be a challenge and a provocation to, there's more, and people's spirits are crying out, there's more. There's more, and we've got to start to show people what the more is, by sharing and being open with our testimony, and not dumping it on people, but releasing it, that will draw them to realizing there's more for their lives as well. Yeah. Anyway, I better leave it